So good morning, everyone. Isn't this an awesome event, right? How many of you have only come here for the first time? Hands up. All right, this is awesome. We're growing. It's been going since 2017, and it is only going to get better. But anyway, this morning we are going to have a great conversation about cannabis in technology. And I think the first question that comes out of this is our panel named the right way, or should it be in reverse, and why? Go for it, guys. Anybody?
So we, right, preparing for this conversation, we think it should be reversed. So I don't think it should be cannabis and biotechnology. We agreed it should be biotechnology and cannabis, if that's okay with everybody.
And why do you say that? Why are you all in agreement with that?
And in the biotech world, the rules have been formed for quite a long time. And we came into it and we want to change the rules towards what we want it to be.
So I'm a medical doctor by education, and through the LGA care we care for 10,000 patients, and I think at that scale you look at things differently. You're looking at the research that's coming out, but you're always in the back of your mind thinking, how is this going to be applicable to patients? How is this going to be available to patients? And I think it's interesting also, we did a little poll before the session and just asked participants of the session, does your doctor right now actually know about terpene profiles? And does he or she use that information for treatment? And we saw that only a third of the people responded, hey, my doctor that influence treatment. So just for me as kind of devil's advocate from a medical perspective, I'm always thinking about, okay, biotechnology, and we're seeing crazy new technologies coming out that are gonna enhance and improve the effects of cannabis. But we're always looking at, okay, when will this be applicable? And let's look at the data.
Well, I think that brings up a really good point, right? So actually, just like the pharmaceutical discussion, cannabis was banned as a plant and a drug right around the time that the formal pharmaceutical industry got going in the 1930s. So how do you guys think, from a medical perspective, from an investment perspective, from an extraction perspective, that this plant is going to impact the biotechnology industry and or vice versa? I know that's a big question, but highlights.
I think we actually have a unique opportunity here from a medical perspective that through cannabis we can offer more personalized treatment. So we have so many access points basically within the plant to say we're gonna do really, kind of cannabis DNA-based treatment. And that's how we look at it. So we are completely data-driven. So we can plug in actually, starting with terpene profiles, but also looking at other biomarkers within the plant and plug that with outcomes of patients. So I think we're just getting started actually.
You have any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, definitely. This is just the beginning from a scientific perspective. Currently, I think we have 1,200, 1,300 studies, trials going on right now with CBD, with THC, 250, 300 different trials. They're looking at multiple different indications, different delivery methods, to bring that medication in. And that's just the beginning now. That's only going forward much quicker, especially since the UN voted to approve this to be a medicine. And as more countries come on, that's going to open up the capital flow for people to make these larger investments into the future and looking more as a biotech rather than a recreational only space that you've seen in other markets.
Well, I have to say, as an American German sitting here, it is very refreshing to hear the doctor on the panel talk about terpenes. That discussion even a couple of years ago was almost unheard of. You didn't hear that. So I think there's going to be other discussions, and I wanted to get into one of the topics that we raised in the green room, which was, what about all of the Delta 8 and the Delta Zeros and the Delta 10s that you're about coming from the US? When is that discussion going to start to hit here, and how is that going to fit into a more formal biotech structure than, say, just the Wild West of recreational?
Yesterday. That's the classic answer to almost anything when you talk to any company. When do you need money, or when's this going to happen? It's always yesterday in cannabis, right? Real quick though, a couple numbers. There's a reason why there's an investment banker on this panel. Just a couple quick few numbers. I have 2 undergrad degrees in science. Worked for 15 years in biotech companies. I'm the inventor on 3 U.S. patents. I worked in investment banking 17 years now. We've worked in cannabis in the US and North America for 8 years. We've worked internationally in cannabis for 6. And then also I've been, for the last 2 years, chairman of the Scientific Advisory Council for Athletes for Care, which is composed of 4 leading scientists: Ethan Rousseau, Guillermo Moreno Sanz from Spain, Raquel Perube, and Deb Kimless. But yeah, so we've worked with a client that's making, we actually talked to a client yesterday who's making HHC. So I don't know if you guys have heard that, but instead of tetrahydrocannabinol, it's hexahydrocannabinol. So that's got a whole different form factor to it. And then you have acetyl groups being added to the things. And then also in Europe, one thing to bring up that's interesting, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals about 2 months ago came out and said that Delta-8 THC is actually now legal nationally under the Farm Bill. So yeah, to your question, where is this all going? And frankly, I don't know myself.
Well, I mean, this is one of the big problems, right? So if you have let's say a Delta-8, which is also being made from CBD right now in the United States, once you get into a much more formalized environment, which is Europe and the medical discussion, how do you see path to market authorizations happening in a situation where, again, it's even more unusual than the drug cannabis? Or do you see, as this becomes more accepted within the biotech and pharmaceutical community, that will flip? Any thoughts on this?
I mean, it's an interesting perspective when you have like the U.S. perspective and you juxtapose that to the way Europe is looking at it. Sure, the U.S. and producers, they're pushing the limits, and the politicians, are either embarrassed to address the issue, or some of the states are addressing the issue and combining these new semi-synthetics, either under cannabis or allowing them to proliferate. But you're very limited from the European perspective. These kind of advances would require, in my mind at least, clinical trials and more data in order to bring these to market or bring these to fruition. And at this point, we for sure are going to be making for R&D purposes semi-synthetics, but the usage is not yet clear in the market. And even terpenes, we're registering those as excipients, flavor. We're not making claims as to what their positive or negative effects may be. So it's fun to watch it from the U.S. perspective. They're way out there, on these products, and in a good way. I don't mean it negatively, but we also have to find out what is the exact science behind it to make this a reality for Europe, in my mind.
Well, this is my next question. Is the biotech discussion really only limited to the medical discussion, or is it a broader spectrum of discussion?
And it would be interesting actually to hear from me from Europe, okay, US being advanced, let's say somewhere between 6 to 20 years, I guess, some ballpark number, but what does it actually mean within the country? So all the new research, all the new applications, also biotech innovations in the US, are they being applied in the US, or is it still kind of, lab bench work? What's your guys?
That's a good question. I think one thing that's interesting that we've been trying to do, and I think everybody in this audience would agree, that everybody knows somebody that's used some kind of preparation and it's really helped them out. So there's a lot, that's the problem, is there's all this anecdotal data, and there's no doubt this plant works. I think the one thing that we're trying to do, we've always tried to work with companies and provide capital so they can do the right experiments or get the right data, whether it's in a clinical trial or something less. I think everybody would agree. Our perspective is the entourage effect is real, but I think in order to really get the value out of this plant, we need to do it on a molecule by molecule basis and kind of deconstruct. There's over, I think, 600 compounds in cannabis sativa. So I think that's one thing that I think everybody in this room and probably everybody on the panel would agree. We need to do the work, whether it's under stringent conditions or even maybe less stringent conditions, to find out really what is the value of this plant and on a molecular basis.
Well, when you get into delivery issues and delivery discussions and the technology that goes along with that, I think that that's also going to have a much more, a greater impact on this discussion. But I'm going to flip this back to you. Do you think that in Europe, there's going to be more of a focus on this discussion from the biotechnology discussion first on the recreational side. And I'm going to throw that out there in part because for those of you who are not German or don't live here, the vast majority of medications in this system are generic. I mean, most Germans are used to going to a doctor, getting a prescription, going to the apotheke or the pharmacy and getting it for 10 years because the government is allowed to pre-negotiate contracts. Is that kind of discussion going to have an impact on this plant and the legalization of it so far? And do you see, like the United States, perhaps more of a discussion of the biotechnology happening in a recreational side first because of the regulatory structure here and the difficulties of getting a mainstream drug into the system? Like nano, for example, or patches, or...
I think that depends a bit on how it all plays out. So what the regulatory framework for legalization of recreation space will really look like. Again, I think we're in a unique situation where we have had 5 years of a medical market in Germany, which was a very advanced law, especially in the European space. And when looking at also the BfArM results, who did like a supervisory study, the results are not great there. So I think from a politician standpoint, with all the different lobbyists involved there, you're going to look at data. You're going to look at hard fact data, which is sometimes a little bit boring, but we have, again, also looking at new types of applications and new types of biotechnology innovations. We can apply that already now in a medical space, have regulated results, have results that we can rely on, and then apply it over in a recreational space.
You're an extractor, so I'm going to throw this back at you for a second. How do I say this? I think that the biotechnology perspective for me is, at this point, is like, how do you separate the cannabinoids out? How do you make them effective, and how you bring them to market beyond the technology itself? But here's my question to you, is in the United States right now, I mean, there's probably better people out there to talk about this, but for example, Delta-8 seems to me to be still a narcotic, even though it's coming from CBD. So just because you're submitting it to a process, chemical process or whatever, does that fundamentally change the nature of a cannabinoid?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. From one point, we're manufacturers. We're not necessarily confined to the beginning stage of extraction. So we're looking to bring finished products to the market and bring authorizations to the market. And Germany is a little bit different in that respect. They've kind of made their own rules, to circumvent, the herbal medicine rules. And that's quite complicated. They're stuck to a singular molecule, dronabinol, and they're looking at compounding, the magisterial prep, and this is fine, for advancing, at least the beginning stages of advancement. But when you look at market authorizations for herbal medicines, these rules have been set well before cannabis got into play in Europe. And you have to think in those terms when you're making whatever medicines you're making, and you're confined to singular elements, THC distillate, CBD distillate, THCA, and these ones like CBN, which you're seeing popping up in Switzerland and the UK, and these don't exist in the monographs, currently. So, there's a lot of, there's a nice building blocks in the beginning, for us to develop medicines, and there's a clear pathway with some countries to get these authorizations. And as other countries kind of, develop their rules, and even if Germany, let's say, goes recreational, what does that mean? Maybe that'll be a flourishing flower market, and at the end, the doctors will be looking for innovative products, more along the extractable basis would be my guess. I mean, who knows?
So I'd like to go back to your question, I think, Marguerite, you had on rec, or adult use, whatever you want to call it, in biotech. So one thing I think that's interesting for people to note is, back in 2013, 2014, I was Chief Business Officer of Cerna, which is one of the first public companies in the space. There's a company at the same time called EBU. EBU was in Colorado, and they had these 4 or 5 formulations that, this is going to make you calm, this is going to make you creative. So I was lucky enough to work at a company called Affymetrix in the late 90s, a leading genomics company, and they essentially came up with the term pharmacogenomics because of their technology. And that's one thing you guys ought to note, is that even on the rec side, one thing we need to do more of is the human genetics side. So if my wife even takes a small preparation of any kind of cannabinoid, she goes off the rails, right? So that's one thing even on the rec side that we can do better on characterizing the human genetic side, the SNPs, the biomarkers, because most people will react differently to these preparations.
And also for medical, so that's actually my question in return, maybe looking at both personalized treatment but also personalized consumption, maybe in a recreational space. Again, I think there's an opportunity, maybe looking at DNA, looking at other biomarkers, to create products that kind of plug in there. So from a creation, from an extraction standpoint, are you looking at what type of data would we need from customers, patients, to then formulate something but still be able to scale, or how are you looking at the market?
Okay, so we had this conversation back in the green room as well. Is this plant fundamentally different to begin with than, say, poppies? Why is cannabis so different from that, and what is that going to have, what impact is that going to have on this discussion as well?
Well, the one thought, and I don't know a whole lot about heroin and poppies, but my guess is that, really they do try to concentrate down heroin to the point of, that's the only active agent. But I mentioned before, there's over 600, could be 600 active agents. I mean, that gets back to the point of, are all these cannabinoids and terpenes have some value to some indication? Or, my guess is some have no value at all, but then maybe do they have value in combination? So I think that's the one thing, getting back to the entourage effect, that's the magic, I think, of cannabis.
Are there any questions from the audience at this point? There's one over there, there's a couple.
I thought you guys were going to talk about.
Well, we are, but I always open there are a lot of experts in the audience also, so there are a couple of questions right up.
We're all experts in this audience. Let's hear it again for Marguerite Arnold.
And the panel.
And the entire panel. You're correct. We'll start up here and then we'll work our way around.
Michael Kagan from Reagenics. I would like to know your opinions about synthetic. Well, there are a number of ways using biotechnology to produce cannabinoids. One is through synthetic chemistry. Some is by biosynthesis using hosts like algae or yeast or bacteria. And then there's the system that we use, which is growing stem cells of cannabis. It doesn't produce the whole entourage effect. It produces specifically a group of cannabinoids. But this is the biotech for the production of cannabis. How is that going to? How are these systems going to impact the regulations in the market?
I think just medically speaking, as a doctor, you're pretty much open to every type of application that is safe in the patient's hands. So I think a little bit boring, but also down to the point. Depends on the data. Depends on the results that you get with it. I think what's interesting at these panels also, we were looking at maybe 200,000 to 300,000 cannabis patients in Germany, which is still tiny. I mean, still by a tenfold at least, so many more patients in Germany could benefit from cannabis. Which also means it needs to be more standard, and it also means types of application needs to be more standard. So I think synthetics, as also Margaret said, when it comes to regular medication in Germany, is one of the ways to go.
Yeah, and also, this has been a war waging for a long time. Hundreds of millions have gone into biosynthesis. They're trying to get to a more economical format. Clearly this is very attractive from the biotech industry, especially in places like USA, where the FDA is more guided on a synthetic basis as opposed to an herbal medicine basis. And you have to keep a global perspective. You have a lot of countries that are going to be coming on that have more herbal medicine, results, like India as an example, and Europe, they're more accepting. But clearly all of them have a space, and if you can reproduce at an economical rate through biosynthesis, through semisynthesis, biocatalysis, whatever your process is, there's a market for it.
One quick thing to add to that, Michael, is I think the interesting thing is we have so many indications, potential indications that could be solved, and you have so many of these molecules in this plant. That matrix that you combine to try to find combinations thereof to deconvolute that, it's going to be a big issue. But one last thing on we don't like to call it synthetics, we like to call it alternative production methods. But what we believe is we have no idea if it's going to be yeast, E. coli chemistry, or some combination of phyto and whatever. But one thing we do believe is the way to do it the cheapest with the highest quality cannabinoids is probably going to win over.
Can I just add, I think how it's produced is one issue, and also then how it's absorbed by the human body. If you think about, for example, a technology like nano, and if, there's a synthetic versus natural discussion there as well, that's getting into some very other long and involved questions. Did you have another comment to make, or?
Noch eine Frage? I have just a question. My name is Armin Brush from Folimed and representing also the medical cannabis division of the association, the German one. I think what you're addressing is, these purely pharmaceutical development questions. Starting from the extract, that's the biotechnology part, with a very clear guidelines on how to get a product or an active actually approved by the authorities. And if you talk about the terpene characterization, do you really see the chance that this can be characterized so that it does fulfill the guidelines and that can will allow an approval of this kind of an active material? And also you're addressing delivery systems, nanos or whatever, which is again purely pharmaceutical questions. And I still feel that the pharmaceutical industry, this audience, is a bit underrepresented. And maybe my question now to you is, how do you rate the complexity in terms of timing and in terms of players in that area, so that at the end there will be a product that does meet the market, both with full characterization of the terpene levels and the actives, but also with delivery systems, from your background now and for your experience from the US market?
Well, one thing I'd add to that, with regards to whether it's the EMA here in Europe or it's the FDA, also since I'm an investment banker, we deal with the SEC. I think everybody in this audience would agree that regulators are always behind the curve, whether it's crypto or cannabis. And matter of fact, if somebody wants to talk to me later, we heard some recent stuff from the FDA. I think that's one question, getting back to your thought on the pharma side, is the regulators, one question we need to figure out is how to do this better, because the regulators are probably going to screw it up. They're already screwing it up. The FDA should have done a lot more than they've already done in the US. And the EMA, supposedly, they're sitting on their hands too. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think that's...
Yeah, I think that describes the current situation, because regulators are really, you could build into this as much as you want on complexity. On the other hand, that would limit finally an approved product. But how do you rate it? And how do you see it maybe different in the US?
Go ahead.
Yeah, from the U.S. perspective, you have to realize that, from a recreational point, we could make a product tomorrow, put it right on the shelf and sell it. And so you can make, hot seller right now for, who knows if it's even, the efficacy is there, but it's CBN and THC for a nighttime sleeper. Now, is that product tested, and does that product have results that are tangible from a medical perspective? Absolutely not. And that's for sure. From the FDA perspective, they turned a blind eye to all of this. And, they're more concentrated on the Epidiolex and the Sativex and a myriad of trials. Like I pointed out at the beginning, there's hundreds of THC trials and thousands, in the 1,000 plus of CBD trials. And you juxtapose that to Europe, and you have, very, very strange regulations in Germany. That's another debate for another time. But then you have, countries like Portugal, which are adopting the herbal rules, which is a path to the ACM, which is a path into the European market. But Germany would, thumb their nose up at that and say, no, this isn't going to work, But, we'll let a pharmacist compound this, in a completely unsanitary environment, and that's great, you have to look at from a country-to-country basis and how they're developing these rules, and are these federal regulators overworked, and do they want to deal with this? And they surely don't want to deal with thousands of cannabis people pushing the limits.
Yeah, thank you.
But thank you all. I'm sorry to cut everybody off. We are running out of time. Let's hear it again for Margaret Arm and the entire panel.